The stars outside the viewing window looked like scattered diamonds against black velvet, and Ambassador Kira Vasquez stood alone watching them spin slowly past the ship's hull. She was the only human aboard the Volante Ascendant, a massive crystalline starship that carried important visitors from 7 different alien civilizations. They were all traveling to a neutral planet called Desert IV for peace talks, and Kira represented Earth in these historic negotiations. The Volante were her hosts, and they were beings made of light and living silicon, who had traveled between stars for thousands of years before humans even learned to make fire. They looked at Kira with polite interest, the way a grown person might look at a curious child. To them, humanity was a baby species that had barely taken its first steps into the galaxy. Captain Sorvith was the leader of the Volante crew, and his body glowed with soft blue light as he moved through the bridge. He had commanded ships across 100 star systems, and he had seen wonders that Kira could not even imagine. When his sensors detected something strange in the atmosphere of Desert IV, he barely gave it a second thought. A minor weather pattern forming over our landing coordinates, one of his officers reported. Sorvith waved a glowing hand in dismissal. Our shields can withstand the radiation of dying suns. A little planetary weather is nothing to concern ourselves with. But Kira had moved closer to the viewing screen, and something cold settled in her stomach as she watched the swirling mass of clouds below. The colors were wrong. The movement was wrong. She had seen this before, not on an alien world, but back home in Oklahoma, where she grew up. She remembered being 7 years old and watching the sky turn green before her grandmother pulled her into the storm cellar. She remembered the sound of wind that screamed like a living thing. She remembered the silence after, and the devastation they found when they climbed back out. "Captain Sorvith," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice calm. "I think we should wait before we go down there." The Volante captain turned his glowing form toward her, and she could feel his amusement, even though he had no face to smile with. "Ambassador Vasquez, I understand that your species is not accustomed to space travel, but I assure you that our technology is more than capable of handling any atmospheric conditions." "With respect, sir, that is not an ordinary storm," Kira pressed. "The rotation pattern and the color of those clouds suggest something much more dangerous." Around the bridge, the other alien delegates had paused their conversations to watch this exchange. The Rethiki were tall insect-like beings with clicking mandibles and compound eyes that calculated everything. The Omnith were floating clouds of gas that changed color with their emotions, and they had turned a curious shade of orange. The Kethsorin were ancient turtle-like creatures with shells covered in glowing symbols. An old delegate Yalmer watched Kira with quiet interest. "What exactly do you believe it to be?" Sorvith asked, and there was a hint of condescension in his musical voice. "On Earth we call it a supercell," Kira explained. "It is a type of storm that creates tornadoes, which are spinning columns of wind that can destroy everything in their path. I grew up in a region where these storms were common, and I learned to recognize the signs." One of the Rethaki delegates made a clicking sound that their translator rendered as laughter. "You compare a storm on your primitive homeworld to conditions on Lesser 4? The atmospheric composition is entirely different. Your experience is irrelevant." Kira felt her face grow hot, but she forced herself to stay calm. "The principles are the same. Warm air rising, cold air falling, rotation caused by wind shear. The scale might be different, but the danger is real." Sorvith's glow flickered in a way that suggested he was losing patience. "Ambassador, we have scanned this planet thoroughly. Our sensors show nothing that our shields cannot handle. We are on a strict schedule, and the other delegations are waiting for us on the surface. We cannot delay because of human superstition." Kira wanted to argue more, but she saw the looks on the faces of the other delegates. They saw her as a representative of a young and foolish species, a child who was afraid of a little bad weather. If she pushed harder, she would damage Earth's reputation and possibly ruin the peace talks before they even began. "I understand," she said quietly, but she did not return to her seat. Instead, she stayed by the viewing screen and watched the storm grow larger as they descended. The Volante Ascendant was a beautiful ship, all curves and crystal and light. It had been built to travel between stars, to withstand the radiation of nebulas and the pull of black holes. Its designers had never imagined that it would face something as simple and as savage as a planetary storm. As they entered the upper atmosphere, the first tremors ran through the hull. The Volante crew exchanged glances, but continued their work with calm efficiency. They had done this thousands of times before. But Kira gripped the railing beside her and felt the vibration growing stronger. The clouds outside the window were getting closer, and she could see them churning and boiling with terrible energy. Lightning flashed in colors she had never seen before, purple and green and a sickly yellow that made her stomach turn. "Captain," one of the officers said, and there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "The wind speeds are higher than our initial readings suggested." "Compensate," Sorvith ordered. The ship shook harder, and somewhere in the distance, Kira heard a sound like breaking glass. The crystalline hull was designed to be flexible, to absorb and redirect energy. But this was different. The wind was not energy to be absorbed. It was physical force, raw and brutal and unrelenting. "Captain, our shields are not designed for this type of stress," another officer reported, and now there was fear in his voice. "The kinetic pressure is exceeding our parameters." Sorvith's glow flickered rapidly, a sign of growing alarm. "All hands, brace for turbulence. Now, take us back up immediately." But it was too late. The storm had them now, and it was not going to let them go. Kira watched as the viewing screen filled with swirling darkness, and she felt the ship begin to fall. Around her, the most advanced beings in the galaxy screamed in terror, as they experienced something their technology had never prepared them for. They were going down, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. The Volante Ascendant hit the ground like a falling star, and the sound was something Kira would never forget. Metal and crystal screamed together as the beautiful ship carved a long trench through alien mud. Kira was thrown across the bridge, and she felt something crack in her shoulder as she slammed into a wall. Sparks flew everywhere, and the elegant lights that had filled the ship flickered and died, replaced by the angry red glow of emergency systems. For a long moment, there was only silence and darkness and the distant howl of wind. Then the screaming started. The Onmouth delegates had been scattered by the impact, their gaseous bodies torn apart and struggling to reform. The Rethaki were clicking frantically, their compound eyes darting in every direction as they tried to calculate what had happened. The Volante crew members flickered weakly, their light forms damaged by the crash. Kira pushed herself up from the floor and gasped at the pain in her shoulder. It was not broken, she decided, but it was badly bruised and would hurt for days. She looked around the ruined bridge and tried to understand what she was seeing. The viewing screen was cracked but still working, and through it she could see nothing but rain and wind and darkness. The storm had not stopped. If anything, it was getting worse. "Status report," Captain Sorvith called out, and his voice was weak and uncertain. "What is our situation?" One of his officers crawled to a damaged console and touched it with trembling hands. "Engines are offline. Navigation is offline. Shields are at 4% and falling. Hull integrity is compromised in multiple sections. We have landed in some kind of basin, and water is beginning to enter the lower decks." The words hit the delegates like physical blows. These were beings who had traveled across galaxies, who had mastered sciences that humans could barely imagine. And now they were stranded in mud, in a storm, with no way to escape. Can we send a distress signal? Asked Delegate Yalmer of the Kefsoren, and his ancient voice was calm despite the chaos around him. The electromagnetic interference from the storm is too strong, the officer replied. Any signal we send will be corrupted or blocked completely. Then what do we do? One of the Rithaki demanded. There must be a solution. Run the calculations again. I have run them 17 times, the officer said. There is no technological solution. Our systems are not designed for this type of environment. Kira listened to them argue, and she felt a strange calmness settle over her. This was bad, she knew. This was very, very bad. But she had grown up in a place where bad things happened regularly, where tornadoes and floods and ice storms were just part of life. She had been taught from childhood that when disaster struck, you did not panic. You did not wait for someone else to save you. You got up and you did what needed to be done. She moved through the damaged bridge, stepping over debris and ignoring the pain in her shoulder. The other delegates barely noticed her as she made her way to the emergency supply station. The panel was dented but still functional, and she pulled it open to see what they had to work with. Thermal blankets designed for the vacuum of space? Useless in wet cold, but they could still provide some insulation. Ration packs calibrated for different alien biologies? She set those aside for later. Medical supplies? Good. They would need those. Emergency beacon? She examined it carefully and then did something that made the nearby Volanti officer gasp in shock. She disabled it. What are you doing? The officer demanded. That is our only way to call for help. Right now, it is our best way to get rescuers killed, Kira replied calmly. The electromagnetic interference will corrupt the signal and send rescue ships to the wrong coordinates, possibly right into the heart of the storm. We need to wait until conditions improve. How do you know this? Captain Sorvith asked, and he had drifted closer to watch her work. Because I grew up with storms, Kira said. Not like this one, maybe, but the same principles apply. Right now, communication is impossible, rescue is impossible, and flying is suicide. Our only option is to survive until the storm passes. The Rithaki delegate who had laughed at her earlier made an angry clicking sound. You suggest we simply wait? Do nothing? That is not a plan. That is surrender. No, Kira said, and she turned to face the alien with hard eyes. Surrender is staying on this ship while it floods and sinks into the mud. What I am suggesting is that we find better shelter, wait out the storm, and then call for help when we have a chance of actually being heard. She pulled up a damaged map of the surrounding terrain on one of the few working screens. There, she said, pointing to a rocky outcropping about 200 meters east of their position. Higher ground with natural shelter from the wind. If we can get there, we have a much better chance of surviving the night. 200 meters in that? One of the Omnith asked, and the gaseous being had turned a pale shade of fear. The wind would tear us apart. Not if we time it right, Kira said. Supercell storms have patterns. The wind is not constant. It comes in waves. There will be lulls, moments when the pressure drops and the wind weakens. If we watch carefully and move quickly, we can make it. How can you possibly know when these lulls will occur? Sorvith asked. Kira looked at him and smiled grimly. I cannot know for certain, but I can feel it. I can read the storm. My grandmother could do it, and her mother before her. It is something humans learned a long time ago, when we had no technology to protect us and survival depended on understanding nature. The aliens looked at each other with expressions that ranged from doubt to fear to desperate hope. They were out of options, and they knew it. Their beautiful ship was dying around them. Their technology had failed, and the only person offering any kind of plan was the representative of the youngest and most primitive species in the room. Old Delegate Yammer was the first to speak. I believe we should listen to the human, he said slowly. She seems to know what she is talking about, and none of us have any better ideas. One by one, the other delegates nodded their agreement. Even the Rithaki, whose pride had been wounded by this reversal of expectations, could not argue with the simple logic of the situation. Kira felt the weight of their trust settle onto her shoulders, and she took a deep breath. This was nothing like the diplomatic negotiations she had trained for. This was survival, pure and simple, and lives depended on the decisions she made in the next few hours. All right, she said. Everyone gather what supplies you can carry. Stay close together and follow my instructions exactly. When I say move, you move. When I say stop, you stop. And whatever you do, do not let go of the person next to you. The storm howled outside, hungry and patient, waiting to claim them all. But Kira was not going to let that happen. Kira stood at the damaged airlock and pressed her hand against the cold metal while she listened to the storm outside. The wind rose and fell in waves, just as she had predicted, and she counted the seconds between each gust while the aliens gathered behind her. 23 beings from 7 different species huddled together in the dark corridor, all of them looking to one small human for guidance. The Volanthi glowed dimly, their light forms weakened by damage. The Rithaki clicked nervously, their calculations offering no comfort. The Omnith had compressed themselves into tight spheres, trying to make themselves as small as possible. The Kethsoin stood with ancient patience, their shells gleaming in the emergency lights. The water is rising faster, Captain Sorith reported. We have perhaps 1 hour before the lower decks are completely flooded. Kira nodded but did not turn around. She was focused on the rhythm of the storm, feeling it in her bones the way her grandmother had taught her. The wind would weaken soon. She could sense it. The pressure was changing. The sound was shifting. And all the old instincts that humans had developed over thousands of years of living with storms were telling her that a lull was coming. Get ready, she said quietly. When I open this door, we move fast and we do not stop until we reach the rocks. Stay in line, hold on to each other, and if someone falls, we all stop to help them. No one gets left behind. How will we see where we are going? One of the Omnith asked. The darkness outside is complete. Kira reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device that she had taken from the emergency supplies. This is a simple light beacon. It is not powerful, but it will show us the way. I will go first and hold it in front of me. The rest of you follow the light. She took a deep breath and felt the fear rising in her chest. What she was about to do was dangerous beyond measure. If she had misjudged the storm, if the lull was shorter than she expected, they could all die out there in the mud and wind. But staying on the ship was certain death, and Kira had always believed that a chance of survival was better than no chance at all. The wind dropped suddenly, and the howling outside became a whisper. Now, Kira shouted, and she slammed her hand against the airlock controls. The door slid open, and Kira ran out into the storm. The rain hit her like 1,000 tiny fists, cold and hard and relentless. She could barely see 3 feet in front of her face, and the mud sucked at her boots with every step. But she kept moving, holding the light beacon high above her head, trusting that the others were following. Behind her, she could hear them struggling. The Rithaki were fast on their many legs, but the mud made them slip and stumble. The Volanthi floated above the ground, but the wind buffeted them constantly, and they had to fight to stay on course. The Omnith were the most vulnerable, their gaseous bodies pulled and stretched by every gust, and the Kethsarn had to help hold them together. 50 meters down, 150 to go. Kira felt the pressure beginning to change, and she knew their time was running out. The lull would not last much longer, and when the wind returned, it would come back with terrible fury. Faster, she shouted over her shoulder. We need to move faster. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain in her shoulder and the burning in her lungs. The ground was rising now, and she could feel rocks beneath the mud. They were getting close. 100 meters down. 100 to go. Something hit her from the side, and she stumbled and nearly fell. It was a piece of debris from the ship, torn loose by the wind and sent flying through the darkness. She felt blood on her cheek, but forced herself to keep moving. Behind her, one of the Rithaki screamed. The wind had caught them off balance, and they had fallen into the mud. Kira turned and saw the insect-like being struggling to rise, their legs tangled in something beneath the surface. "Help them!" she shouted to the nearest Volanthi. "Do not leave them behind." The Volanthi officer did not hesitate. He floated back and grabbed the Rithaki with arms made of solid light, pulling them free from the mud and pushing them forward. It was not elegant, it was not dignified, but it worked. 150 meters down. 50 to go. The wind was beginning to rise again, and Kira could feel the pressure building like a weight on her chest. They had maybe 30 seconds before the full force of the storm returned. "Run!" she screamed. "Everyone run!" She sprinted the final distance with everything she had, and her lungs felt like they were on fire, and her legs felt like they were made of stone. The rocky outcropping loomed out of the darkness, a dark mass against the slightly lighter sky. She could see the overhang that she had spotted on the map, a shallow cave carved by ancient water that would protect them from the worst of the wind. She reached it and turned to count the others as they came stumbling out of the rain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 11, 12, 20, 21, 22. Where was the last one? Kira's heart froze as she realized that old Delegate Yammer was not among them. She looked back into the storm and saw a dim shape struggling through the mud, moving far too slowly. The wind was coming. She did not think. She ran back out into the storm, back toward the old Kethsoran diplomat. He had fallen, she saw, and he was trying to push himself up with trembling arms, but his ancient body could not find the strength. Kira reached him just as the first gust of the returning wind hit them. She grabbed his arm and pulled with all her might, screaming at him to get up, to move, to not give up. Yammer looked at her with ancient eyes, and for a moment she thought he was going to tell her to leave him. Yammer looked at her with ancient eyes, and for a moment she thought he was going to tell her to leave him. But then he saw something in her face, some desperate determination that touched something deep inside him, and he pushed himself to his feet. Together they staggered the final 20 meters to the shelter, while the wind screamed around them and debris flew through the air like weapons. Kira felt something hit her back hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs, but she kept moving, kept pulling, kept refusing to let the storm win. They fell into the shelter just as the full fury of the storm returned. The wind roared past the opening of the overhang, spraying rain and mud inside, but they were protected from the worst of it. They had made it. Kira lay on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath, her entire body shaking with exhaustion and relief. Around her, 22 alien beings were doing the same, all of them still alive, all of them safe because of her. Old Yammer reached out and touched her hand with his wrinkled fingers. "Thank you, Ambassador Vasquez," he said quietly. "You risked your life for mine." Kira managed a weak smile. "That is what humans do," she said. "We do not leave people behind." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside their tiny shelter, something had changed. The aliens were no longer looking at Kira as a representative of a primitive species. They were looking at her with something that might have been the beginning of respect. But the night was still young, and the storm was far from over. They had found shelter, but survival was not yet guaranteed. Kira pushed herself into a sitting position and looked around at their little group. "All right," she said. "Now we wait. And while we wait, we prepare. She had gotten them this far. Now she had to get them through the long night ahead. The shelter was small and crowded, but it was dry, and the wind could not reach them inside. Kira sat with her back against the cold stone wall and watched the storm rage outside while the aliens huddled together around her. They had been there for 3 hours now, and the storm showed no signs of stopping. Rain pounded the rocks above them, and lightning split the sky every few seconds, turning the darkness into brief flashes of terrible brightness. The sound was constant, a roaring and howling that made normal conversation almost impossible. But Kira was not content to simply wait. She moved through the group, checking on each of the delegates, making sure they were as comfortable as possible under the circumstances. The Omnith were having the hardest time. Their gaseous bodies were not meant for this kind of environment, and the pressure changes were causing them pain. Kira sat with them and explained in simple terms what was happening, how the storm created areas of high and low pressure, how the wind moved between them. Understanding the science seemed to help them feel less afraid, and they were able to relax their forms slightly. The Rithaki were frustrated. They were beings of logic and calculation, and they were used to solving problems with their minds. But there was no solution to calculate here, no formula that would make the storm go away. Kira set them to work organizing the supplies they had brought, counting rations and medical equipment, creating an inventory of everything they had. It was simple work, but it gave them something to focus on besides their fear. The Volanthi were weakened, their light forms flickering dimly in the darkness. Kira asked them about their ship mind, the living consciousness that controlled the Ascendant, and they explained that it had been badly damaged in the crash. They were worried about it. She could tell, the way humans might worry about an injured friend. She listened to them talk about the ship mind's personality, its quirks and preferences, and she realized that for all their differences, the Volanthi loved their ship the same way humans loved their homes. Old Yalmer sat beside her for most of the night, his ancient shell providing warmth against the cold. He had been a diplomat for over 200 years, he told her, and he had seen many strange things across the galaxy. But he had never experienced anything quite like this. "Tell me about your homeworld," he asked during a brief lull in the storm. "Tell me about these storms you speak of." Kira thought about Oklahoma, about the flat plains and the big sky, and the way the clouds would build on summer afternoons. She thought about the tornado sirens and the storm cellars, and the way her grandmother would watch the sky with calm eyes. "Earth is a dangerous place," she said quietly. "We have storms that can destroy entire cities, waves that can drown coastlines, mountains that explode with fire, and the ground itself shakes and breaks apart. For most of our history, we had no way to protect ourselves from any of it. We just had to survive. How did your species ever develop civilization under such conditions?" Yammer asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. Kira smiled sadly. "We learned to adapt. We learned to read the signs, to predict the dangers, to build shelters and create warnings. We learned that we could not control nature, but we could learn to live with it. And we learned to help each other, because no one can survive alone." "The Kefsarn evolved on a world with no storms," Yalmer said thoughtfully. "Our greatest danger was the slow changing of the seasons, the long winters that could last for decades. We learned patience and endurance, but we never learned to react quickly to sudden dangers." "Every species has its strengths," Kira said. "Yours is patience. Mine is adaptability. Tonight we need both." The storm raged on, and the hours passed slowly. Kira did what she could to keep everyone's spirits up, telling stories about Earth, asking questions about their homeworlds, helping them feel like they were part of a group rather than isolated individuals trapped by circumstance. Around midnight, the rain began to pour into their shelter through a crack in the rock above. The water pooled on the floor and began to rise, threatening to flood their only safe space. "We need to redirect this," Kira said, and she grabbed a piece of debris that someone had carried from the ship. "Help me dig a channel to drain the water outside." The Volanthi captain looked at her with confusion. "You want us to dig? With our hands? Do you have a better idea?" Kira asked. Sorvis stared at her for a long moment, and then he knelt down beside her and began to scrape at the stone floor with his hands of solid light. One by one, the other delegates joined them, Rithaki and Kethsorin and even the Omnith, who used their gaseous forms to push the loose dirt aside. It was hard work, and it took over an hour, but they managed to create a rough channel that carried the water away from their shelter and out into the storm. When they were done, they were all exhausted and covered in mud, but they had solved the problem together. Captain Sorvith looked at his dirty hands with an expression of amazement. "I have not performed manual labor in 300 years, he said. "I had forgotten what it felt like." Kira laughed, and after a moment, the others laughed with her. It was a strange sound in the middle of the storm, but it felt good. Later, when the laughter had faded and the darkness seemed to press in around them, one of the Rithaki asked Kira a question that surprised her. "Are you afraid, Ambassador Vasquez?" She considered the question carefully before answering. "Yes," she admitted. "I am afraid. I have been afraid since I first saw this storm from orbit. I am afraid right now, sitting in this cave, not knowing if we will survive until morning." "But you do not act afraid," the Rithaki observed. "You act as if you know exactly what to do." "That is because fear and action are not the same thing," Kira explained. "On Earth, we have a saying, courage is not the absence of fear. It is acting despite fear. My grandmother used to tell me that everyone is afraid when the storm comes. What matters is what you do with that fear." "What did your grandmother do with her fear?" Yammer asked quietly. Kira closed her eyes and remembered. "When I was 7 years old, a massive tornado struck our town. My grandmother was alone with me and my 2 younger brothers. She had maybe 60 seconds of warning, and she used every single one of them. She grabbed us, ran to the storm cellar, and held us in her arms while the world was destroyed above us." She opened her eyes and looked around at the aliens who were listening with rapt attention. "When we came out, our house was gone. The entire neighborhood was gone. But we were alive, all 4 of us, because my grandmother knew that the worst thing you can do in a crisis is nothing. She used her fear as fuel to act, and that is what saved us." The storm continued to howl outside, but inside the shelter, something had changed. The fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. The aliens looked at their human companion with new understanding, and they began to believe, truly believe, that they might actually survive this night. "Tell us more about your grandmother," Yammer said softly. And so Kira talked through the long night, sharing stories of human resilience and survival, of the countless ways her species had learned to endure in a hostile universe. She talked about floods and fires, earthquakes and epidemics, wars and winters. She talked about how every disaster had taught humanity something new, how every loss had made them stronger. And as she talked, the storm outside began to weaken. Dawn came slowly to Thesser 4, a gray light that crept across the battered landscape like a hesitant visitor. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world that looked like it had been scraped raw by the fury of the gods. Kira stepped out of the shelter and took a deep breath of clean air. Her body ached in places she did not know could ache, and her uniform was torn and stained with mud and blood, but she was alive. They were all alive. Behind her, the alien delegates emerged one by one, blinking in the pale light. They looked at the destruction around them with expressions of shock and disbelief. Trees had been ripped from the ground and scattered like children's toys. Rocks had been moved, entire hillsides had shifted, and the basin where the Velanthi Ascendant had crashed was now a lake. If we had stayed on the ship, Captain Sorvis said quietly, we would have drowned. Yes, Kira agreed. We would have. The Ascendant itself was barely visible, only the tip of its crystalline spire poking above the muddy water. The beautiful ship that had crossed galaxies was now nothing more than wreckage at the bottom of a storm-created lake. All that technology, all that elegant design, all those centuries of advancement, destroyed by wind and rain and pressure. Kira pulled out the emergency beacon she had disabled the night before and began working on it with careful fingers. The electromagnetic interference was gone now, and she was able to reconfigure it to send a clear signal. Within minutes, she had it broadcasting their location to any ships that might be listening. Rescue vessels should arrive within a few hours, she announced to the group. The other delegations will have been watching for us, and they will send help as soon as they receive our signal. The aliens nodded, but none of them seemed eager to leave the shelter. They stood in small groups, talking quietly among themselves, processing everything that had happened. Kira gave them space and turned her attention to treating the minor injuries that people had sustained during the night. Old Yammer came to sit beside her as she bandaged a cut on one of the Rithaki's arms. I have been thinking, he said, about what you told us last night. What part? Kira asked. All of it, Yammer replied. Your stories about human history, about the disasters your species has faced, about the way you have learned to survive. I have been alive for over 200 years, Ambassador, and I have met many species. But I do not think I have ever met one quite like yours. Kira finished the bandage and looked at the old diplomat. What do you mean? Most species in the galaxy developed on worlds that were relatively stable, Yammer explained. The Velanthi evolved on a planet where the climate never changed. The Rithaki came from a world with no weather at all. Even my own people, the Kethsoran, only had to deal with slow, predictable changes over centuries. We had time to develop technology to protect ourselves before we faced any real dangers. He paused, and his ancient eyes were thoughtful. But humans are different. You evolved on a world that was actively trying to kill you. Storms, earthquakes, volcanoes, ice ages, and 100 other disasters. And you had no technology to protect you. Not for most of your history. You had to survive with nothing but your bodies and your minds. That is true, Kira admitted. We are a very young species by galactic standards. We only discovered technology a few thousand years ago. And yet you survived, Yammer said. Not just survived, but thrived. And now I understand why. It is not because you are smarter than other species, or stronger, or more advanced. It is because you learned something that the rest of us never had to learn. What is that? How to be small, Yammer said simply. How to be vulnerable. How to face dangers that you cannot control and find ways to survive anyway. The rest of us built shields and barriers. We used technology to separate ourselves from nature. But humans learned to work with nature, to read its patterns and adapt to its rhythms. You learned that you cannot defeat a storm, but you can survive it. Kira thought about his words and realized that he was right. Every species in the galaxy had developed technology to overcome their environment, to make themselves safe and comfortable. But humans had developed something else, something harder to define but just as important. They had developed resilience. The rescue ships arrived a few hours later. Sleek vessels from the Lesser 4 surface station. The crews were shocked to find the delegates alive and mostly unharmed. Everyone had expected the worst when the Ascendant went down in the storm. As they loaded the survivors onto the rescue ships, Captain Sorvith approached Kira. His light form was still weak, but there was something different in the way he looked at her. Ambassador Vasquez, he said formally. I owe you an apology. For what? Kira asked. For not listening to you, Sorvith replied. You tried to warn me about the storm, and I dismissed you because I thought your species was too primitive to understand the technology of our sensors. I was arrogant and foolish, and it nearly cost us all our lives." Kira shook her head. "You made a decision based on the information you had. There is no shame in that. There is when the information was wrong," Sorvis said. "You knew things that our sensors did not. You could read the storm in ways that our technology could not. That is not primitive, Ambassador. That is a different kind of knowledge, and it may be more valuable than anything we have." The peace talks proceeded on schedule, held in the surface station while the delegates recovered from their ordeal. But the tone of the negotiations was different from what anyone had expected. The alien delegates treated Kira with a new level of respect, and they listened carefully when she spoke. And when the final treaty was signed, it included a clause that no one had anticipated. "The Galactic Council hereby establishes the Human Advisory Course," the document read. "A group of human observers who will accompany all future expeditions to uncharted or dangerous worlds. Their role will be to provide guidance on survival in hostile environments, drawing on the unique experiences of the human species." Kira read the clause with surprise. "I do not understand," she said to Delegate Yammer, who had proposed the amendment. "You want humans to advise you on survival? We are the youngest species here." Yammer smiled, and his ancient face was warm. "That is exactly why we want you," he said. "The rest of us have forgotten what it means to be young, to be vulnerable, to face a universe that does not care about our technology or our achievements. But humans remember. You carry that knowledge in your blood, in your stories, in the way you react when danger strikes." He placed a wrinkled hand on her shoulder. "The galaxy is not a safe place, Ambassador. It is wild and ancient and full of storms. And sometimes the youngest species in the room is the only one who remembers how to survive them." Kira looked out the window at the battered landscape of Desert, at the lake that had swallowed the Volanti Ascendant, at the clouds that were already beginning to build again in the distance. She thought about her grandmother, about the storm cellar, about all the generations of humans who had faced impossible odds and found ways to keep going. "We will be honored to help," she said finally. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could hear her grandmother's voice, calm and steady as always. "When the storm comes, you do not give up. You do not surrender. You hold on tight. You help your neighbors, and you wait for the dawn. That is what humans do. That is what we have always done." And that, Kira realized, was why humanity mattered. Not because they were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because they had learned to survive when survival seemed impossible. The galaxy was vast and dangerous and full of wonders beyond imagining. But as long as there were humans to face its challenges, there would always be hope. The storm had passed, but Kira knew that more storms would come. And when they did, humanity would be ready.